who gets one? So that's sort of our next step. I'm just gonna, there we go. So who gets one? So basically, first of all, we hear that phrase IEP thrown around all the time. And so it's best to define it. Really, an IEP is an individual education plan. Okay, so by definition, it means a plan specifically for your child and not necessarily any other child. Okay, in French, it's referred to as a PEI, which, if memory serves me correctly, stands for Plan d'éducation individuelle. Okay, but basically, what the IEP does is it outlines what supports and services students are entitled to at school. Okay, it, it is a lengthy document. Usually, it involves a lot of moving parts, but for the most part, in the IEP, all of these things are required to be there. So you'll see the accommodations for instruction, the environment, and assessment. You'll see curriculum modifications if there are any. Sometimes there are alternative expectations that are outside of the curriculum that get included in an IEP. It also includes any specialized equipment that your child requires. So it could be occupational therapy type equipment, it could be computer technology, whatever equipment is signed specifically for your child, that's listed in the IEP. And then it also includes like personal demographic information, identifying information such as the student's education number, birth date, all that kind of stuff. It also includes an assessment summary. So whatever assessments that have been provided to the school, either because they've been done by the school board or because as a parent you've chosen to share that assessment with the school, that will all be recorded in there. Just a summary of it will be recorded in there. We also ensure that students' strengths and needs are included on the IEP. And it also contains a record of consultations. So how often we make contact, parent and school, when information is sent home, that annual meeting, if your student has been identified as an exceptional pupil, all that kind of stuff gets included in that record of consultations. So again, there's a lot to this. It's really, really heavy. And so just we need to know that there are legal components to it. So in Ontario, and this may be different elsewhere, but in Ontario, students who have been identified by what's called an IPRC committee, which stands for Identification, Placement, and Review, that committee determines whether or not a student meets criteria to be exceptional. And when they are, and the committee decides that is the case, the IEP must follow. And there's actually legal implications for that. It is the law that any student identified as exceptional have an IEP. And also legally speaking, a school would have 30 days from the time a student is identified to provide that IEP or a copy of that IEP to parents. Okay, so again, there definitely are legal components to it. And all of that information can be found on the ministry's website. Now, sometimes a school team may decide to develop an IEP for a student that hasn't been identified as exceptional. The ministry has 12 categories for exceptionality, but sometimes a student might not meet those criteria, but the school team still really feels that that student their needs need to be addressed differently. And so for that reason, they'll create an IEP, and they're kind of commonly referred to as non-exceptional IEPs or an IEP. Your teachers say that. And basically all that means is it's an IEP that has the same components to a straight IEP. It's just that it doesn't necessarily come from the recommendation of an IPRC committee. Okay. I also, because we're here under the umbrella of PCMH, I want parents to understand that there actually is no category set out by the Ministry of Education that technically encompasses mental health specifically. Okay, so when we're trying to recognize a student as exceptional, there is no category for mental health or any sort of diagnoses of that nature. So if your child has another area in which they meet criteria for exceptionality, they could be identified under that category. but it wouldn't be specifically just for the mental health need. Okay, so that student may end up with a non-exceptional IEP. There is one category outlined by the ministry that sometimes students with mental health needs fit into, and that's the category of behavior. It's a category that's a little bit more loosely defined in terms of the criteria within the ministry's definition. So sometimes that's a place where students can be deemed exceptional. But whether they're exceptional or whether they are working with a non-exceptional IEP, the you really can't tell the difference in the day-to-day school setting. So what can it do for you? And so why do you want an IEP for your child? The key is that an IEP lets educators know that they need to do something differently. And it basically almost works itself out to be like a bill of rights for your child. These are the things my child must have or needs in order to be successful. So it's that guarantee of sorts that they get what they need. And it's also the grounds with which you can speak up when their needs are not being met. Okay? Basically, the IEP lets everyone know that there are adjustments being made at school and which adjustments are happening and which things may not be happening. So IEPs are great things to share with family doctors, for example, or any other paraprofessionals that are working with your child, because it clearly says this is what the school is doing, and anything that's not in it there would be no expectation that adjustment would be being made. Okay. IEPs are great in the sense that they can support academic needs, they can support social emotional needs, and they can support behavioral needs. The trouble with IEPs for parents and non educators in general is that it comes with a lot of acronyms. And PCMH also has a great source on their website for all of these kinds of acronyms. But these are some of the ones that come up most frequently connected to the IEP. Okay? So someone might want to know, what is the assessment, or what does assessment mean in terms of the IEP? Basically, the assessment is the proof of the student's need. And there are many different kinds of assessments that could be that proof. There are things like speech and language assessments, there are occupational therapy assessments, psychoeducational assessments, psychological assessments, all kinds of different assessments that could be that proof that the student, has a particular need. When we talk about identification, really I like to think of it as the rubber stamp of eligibility. It is that guarantee that you meet the ministry's criteria of exceptionality. Okay, so we always hope that it always declares who's eligible, but I always hope that it also explains and gives us some understanding. Okay, so those categories can be helpful because they can create a very quick image, overall image of what that student's needs potentially are. Okay. We always go back to the IEP because students are different. And so within that category can be fairly broad. So the student's needs can differ a little bit, but it is still that quick picture as to what the student might need at school. That IEP really is the detailed piece of what the needs are and what the strengths strengths are as well. We also talk about placement at school, and placement is really just refers to the kind of classroom or the supports for your child. So there are a couple of different categories that can be requested through that IPRC meeting. And one placement is the regular classroom. But just because the students in the regular classroom doesn't mean there isn't anything happening. And so students in the regular classroom can be eligible for support within the classroom. They can also be eligible for withdrawal support depending on what programs and services the school has to offer. A placement could also be what we call a self-contained classroom. And a self-contained classroom is a smaller classroom with a higher ratio of adults to students. So they are capped and they are staffed differently than a regular classroom. And within those classrooms, there's often opportunities to work outside of the Ontario curriculum. So it's great for students who need extra things like life skills or social emotional. They have social emotional needs that would benefit from very specific instruction. So those classrooms are great for that, but they do work outside of the regular classroom. We also have self-contained schools within the province. So those are entire schools that are comprised of self-contained classrooms. So that's a different environment too, in the sense that in a self-contained school, every pupil within that building is exceptional. And then finally, there's a fourth category that isn't as well known about, and that's the provincial schools. So we have provincial schools in this province, excuse me, for students with very specific needs. So we have provincial schools for students with really significant learning disabilities. There's a provincial school for students who are deaf and hard of hearing, blind and low vision. So really specialized environments that students get support from experts that are hard to necessarily staff across the vast geography that is Ontario. So sometimes it's easier and more beneficial to the student to actually go to a provincial school where the focus is on those specific needs. Sometimes we also talk about, around the IEP, we talk about behavior safety plans or behavior management plans, and those are often attached to IEPs or, like I say, highly connected to IEPs. Because while a behavior safety plan is about keeping the student safe at school, it also needs to be about um, not just addressing behavior, but having a proactive approach as well. So often in an IEP, for students with behavioral challenges, there will be expectations and goals set around that positive reinforcement and the program goals and the plans to manage the student's behaviors. The student learns to self-manage their behavior. And then the safety plan kind of gets attached to it because it then goes through the what ifs or what happens when there is some additional needs that need to be met in terms of safety. I talked a little bit about this already. So we have those self-contained classrooms, those specialized classrooms. They're often referred to as ISP classes, which really just stands for intensive support. So it just lets you know as a parent that what's happening in that classroom is a little bit more intensive than you would find in a regular classroom. What's also important, and that is included in the whole IEP process and process for students transitioning with um, as they age out of school, is something called a TAY protocol. And a TAY protocol, kind of like the IEP, there it's legally binding and it's a process that is engaged in. The ministry outlines that all students in self-contained classes have a TAY protocol, have that, and TAY actually stands for transitional aged youth. And it's really just that transition planning. So for students in self-contained classrooms, when they complete school, sometimes they're headed off into the workforce. Sometimes they need additional day programs. And so part of the TAY protocol is making sure that the plan is set for where that student is going to go next and what they're going to do next. Because we know that, particularly for students with intellectual needs and other exceptionalities where the need is significant, we know that sometimes um, Rome isn't built in a day and the plan isn't made in a day. It's a slow building process. And so we work on this from the time that students are about 12, 13. We start to talk about this. And this can be something as simple as bringing agencies into IPRC meetings so that the planning is set, the funding is set, all the things are set for the student as they finish school. Okay? And the last part that is highly connected to the IEP is funding for equipment. Okay, it's often referred to as SIA equipment. SIA simply stands for special education amount, and that's the funding where the money comes from to pay for that equipment. So it's government. The governments give the money to the boards, and it's to be used for that student and that student only. So this is the part of the IEP that is common for just about all students. All students with IEPs typically have accommodations. Okay, that's sort of adjustments made within the classroom to help students access the grade level curriculum for the grade that they're in. So accommodations, there's three different kinds. It could be instructional, like access to board notes from the teacher. It could be environmental, so it could be the physical setup of the room and where they are and what they need. And also it can be accommodations around assessment, so giving students extra time for tests, for example. Um, that's an accommodation that we would provide. They're still writing the same test that everybody else in the classroom is, they're just getting the extra time to do that. So accommodations, again, just kind of help us access what everybody else in the classroom is accessing. So sometimes that's all that's on an IEP in terms of adjustments, is just accommodations. Other times we'll need to modify the curriculum for the student. And there's a couple of ways that we can modify the curriculum for a student. We can change the number of expectations that we're going to focus on each term, so that we're only maybe focusing on the really key ideas, and to ensure, that the student has grasped that concept. The other thing that we can do to modify a curriculum is adjust the grade level at which they're working. So those are other options that sometimes are included in IEPs. And the last section is the alternative expectations. And those are the ones that come from outside of the Ontario curriculum. And like I say, we see those most often for students in intensive support classes, because perhaps they have specific goals around communication, or perhaps around behavior. So those expectations are driven by the paraprofessionals working with the student, and the school, not really driven by the Ontario curriculum. So again, IEPs and the whole process, that's a lot. I just shared a lot of content with you. And I know sometimes we can listen and understand in the moment and walk away from a meeting, perhaps with a lot of people around the table, and think to ourselves, I'm not sure what this is. Or we get the IEP, it comes home and we look at it and we say, I'm not sure what is meant by this. So please always make sure you ask, whether it's in an IEP meeting, whether it's after the IEP comes home, um, like whether it's face to face on the phone, make sure you ask. If you're not sure and you don't understand why something's being chosen for your child, ask, why has this approach been chosen? Why are we working with this program? Because what needs is that program going to address? So maybe we aren't familiar with the kind of program it is, but when the special education teacher explains the program and what the goals are of it, then we're going to see how it fits with our child's needs. It's also fair of parents to ask who's delivering services and supports, how often are those services and supports being delivered, and when, what time of day, where in the classroom, outside of the classroom, and if it's not one-on-one, who else will be a part of that? Is it a small group intervention? Is it an individual intervention where it's just the paraprofessional, it's just the speech and language pathologist with your child? Or maybe the speech and language pathologist is working a couple of days a week with your child, and maybe a couple of days a week with a small group. So you have every right to know exactly what that looks like and to ask, because like I say, the IEP is a lot of pages and it's not always super clear. So always ask if you're unsure. And last, feel free to ask, how is this program going to be evaluated? How do we know if it's working? And how are we going to decide what progress looks like? Okay, so how is it being measured? Those are all fair questions for parents to ask. So when you're going through this process, I like to think of it as living the lingo, when you're kind of living in all those acronyms and all these meetings, and it can be a lot. And within all that, as parents, it's our job to advocate for our child, especially when they're young. And even as they get older, it's our job to advocate as well as to teach them how to advocate. So that's a whole process. And kind of like when I talked about the TABE protocol and leaving school, that's a process. This is a process too. Students don't own their needs and their IEPs and the ability to advocate for themselves overnight. It really is a built process. So you've got this IEP, and it's got your child's needs on it. It's got all the adaptations, everything's listed there for you. It can be a lot for you as an adult to understand and explain, and it can certainly be a lot for your child to understand and explain. So, anytime we can kind of talk about it in ways that are developmentally appropriate for your child so that they can start to understand who they are as a learner and they can start to explain what it is that they need. I'll never forget, Ben coming home from school. He was about 8 years old and just beside himself, just in tears. And I said, "What happened, buddy?" And he said, "There was a new madame today, and she all of my work. She said it was messy and said I had to start over because I wasn't trying very hard." And poor Muffin was just devastated because he really had done his best work, and has what we call graphomotor needs. So he has actual needs around printing. So he really had done his best printing. And, it was a new staff member, new into the classroom, who didn't know him, didn't know that those were his needs, and misread the situation. And it really impacted him. So that was kind of the red flag for me as a parent, that we we needed to teach him how to stand up for himself, how to advocate for himself, how to say, like, no, this is me and this is my best work. And like, this is okay because it really is my best. So we started to talk to Ben about what his strengths were and what his needs were. And we kind of talked around it till we had a sort of catchphrase he could use with adults who didn't know him. So he started to say things like, around the age of 10, he would say, "You know what? Like, I talk like I'm 20 and I write like I'm 6. Like, these things don't line up. I'm actually really smart, but that writing is hard for me." And so that he would be able to say to an adult walking into the room saying, "Oh, you should, like, do that again, or try harder," or whatever had happened to him before. You could say, "Listen, I have trouble with writing. I am not, like, I am trying my best. This is my best work. I just really struggle with writing." So that was key. But for him, that phrase, "I talk like I'm 20," really got people's attention, because here's this little kid going, "I talk like I'm 20, but I write like I'm 6." And so for him, it was that acceptance of his need, but also the pride in his strengths. And so anytime we can do that for our kids and we can give them that lingo, that phrasing that they can use, that's going to help to build that self-esteem. I will say too, it's sometimes really hard to come up with the that phrase, that sort of catchphrase that your child's going to be able to use. And depending on their communication skills, we may do this advocacy work for them a long time. But like I say, it's super important. So we'll talk a little bit more about advocacy, some things that you can access if you need them. Let's see, get this next slide going. I'm gonna ask Andrea for a little help. See if we can get to the next slide. I'm not sure what's going on. The joys of online presentations. Things don't always go exactly as we planned. I just have to laugh. I'm just going to roll with it, and I have to laugh, and that's just how it goes. But yeah, I would say as a parent, definitely the biggest challenge is that advocacy piece. And it really starts with knowing your child, knowing their learning profile, knowing where those strengths are and where those needs are. And sometimes we get that information, and often we get that information from a formal assessment. And if you've ever had the opportunity, or your child's had something like a psychological or psychoeducational assessment, they're very, very, very lengthy. Um, I've seen reports that are 18, 20 pages plus, right? There's a lot of content, and it's a lot to sort of break down. And for me, as somebody who learns visually, anytime there's a graph of scores, I find that really helpful. And so if you have an assessment and there is no graph of scores, um, if you can print off a bell curve and plot your child's scores along them, I always find that really, really useful. So I'm going to even just show you if I can, since we're having some tech issues. I don't know how this will show up on the screen, but that's an example, right, of a graph. And that is simply a student's scores from an assessment. And like I say, it has a real visual component to it. And just so you know, in this case, in this graph, all these bars in the gray sort of zone, oh, sorry, in the gray sort of zone are in the average range. And so those are the student's strengths. Those are the things the student does as well as anybody else their age. But if I take a look, I can see that some of these scores are falling below that bar. And so that's where the needs are. So in this case, this student struggles with reading, okay, and writing. But if you look at the math down here, it's all in that average range. So I know that that student has a strength in math, but definitely has some needs in reading and writing. And that kind of a profile where there are nice scores that show processes about learning are nice and strong, and their cognitive ability, their IQ is nice and strong. But then we have this area of weakness around an academic subject. That's that clue that the student likely has a learning disability. And that's kind of what similar to what Ben's profile looks like. So he has those needs around writing, like I've described, but those IQ scores are in the average range. And in order to be considered a student with a learning disability, you have to have average to above average intelligence. So that tells us right away. And that's why I said a little while ago that those ministry definitions can be useful. Their students are all different, but those categories can tell us in a quick second a little bit about that child as a learner. So if I see the child has a learning disability, I know that they have average to above average intelligence. I know they're smart. So if the work they're giving me or what they're able to give me doesn't look like someone their age, that's where their need is. It's not that they aren't smart, they are smart. I know that just by knowing that they have a learning disability, because in order to meet criteria, you have to have that average to above average intelligence. Whereas if I see, I know that this student has an intellectual need, perhaps they're gifted, then I know that they're going to have IQ that is above that average range and be really, really smart. Whether or not the schoolwork looks like that is a whole other issue, but I know that they have that capability and that understanding. So that's super important. And then, you know, so like I say, that's kind of why those identifications matter. Just because they're a snapshot, it's not a full description of a child, but when you're encountering someone, it kind of gives us a little bit of that background information really, really quick. So that's important. Again, like I said, as a parent, advocacy is hard. It really is not an easy road. Some years are going to be easier than others, but there's always work to be done, and it can be tiring. So when we're feeling tired as parents because we're trying to get something accomplished, and it feels like nothing moves fast enough, it feels like the process is slow. Having the tools and knowing what the obligations are of the school and to get things done or to get information to you is important. So, for example, it's really important to know that those individual education plans legally have to be in your hands within 30 school days, which is right around now. So, we don't count weekends, we count school days in the education world. So, parents should have those IEPs for their students, because remember I said 30 days, right? Legally the school has to give you that document within 30 days of an IPRC or within 30 days of the school year. So if that's something that hasn't made it into your child's backpack, then that's something that we need to follow up with as parents. So again, we're sometimes chasing things a lot. And these are really great. Like I say, IAPs are really good documents because they're really helpful and they make it very clear about what your child's needs are and what's happening or what's not happening at school when you aren't with them. But it can be sometimes a hard choice as to whether or not we want to go down that road as parents. And so we have to always think about timing. So when do I ask for this IEP if my child doesn't have one? And I have to think about when does it need to be looked at again? So we're working with an assessment. That's what drove that IEP. Maybe that assessment is from when your child was 7 or 8, and now they're about to go into high school. So maybe it's time to revisit that and to redo that assessment. Excuse me, because children grow and change and they make progress, and we want their current needs to be the ones that we're focusing on. So our goals are always up to date. Assessments are expensive, so they're not easy to get. So sometimes it's all about timing. It's about figuring out when it's going to fit best into their academic life, since we don't get to do them annually. So, for example, when students are transitioning to high school, it's a great time to look at reassessment. It's also a great time to look at reassessment as they're heading into post-secondary education. If you're not feeling that the most recent assessment still holds true or still is valid, if it feels like those goals are outdated. So that's a process that we're constantly working through. And that assessment is, like I say, what drives the IEP. So it's that guarantee that your child's needs are going to be met. And so the IEP is really important. Like I say, when we transition from, elementary to secondary, it's also really important when students transition from high school into post-secondary education, because it's that guarantee that your child's needs are going to be met. So if your child needs a computer to get their work done, and really can't accomplish all of their work without it because they struggle to read at grade level or whatever the reason is that they need it, then you bring that to college or university when you go as a student, and then that technology is provided to you. Um, if you need extra time for tests and exams, well, you're going to need that. If you need that in high school, you're going to need that in college or university. So you're going to want your as the individual who's now an adult and taking over that responsibility from my parents, who may have done that for me for years, advocated for me. I need to know what's in that IEP because I need to know what to ask for as I'm an independent adult going into that building. Okay. So the IEP remains important throughout your child's. It can help us to access things like disability supports, right? It's that proof of need, right? If we're talking about disability supports for students, it's those decisions are made based on need. So the IEP can help along with that assessment to prove that that's what your child needs in order to be successful. So it remains important for the long haul. So we need to know what puts an IEP, um, an IEP at risk of being removed. Okay, so there are certain conditions where IEPs um, don't necessarily follow the student. And so it's always important to know that. So, for example, identifications and IEPs follow this child within the school system they're in. So the challenge is when families need to relocate or when families move from one school board to another, there's no guarantee that that identification or that IEP or that placement will continue. Okay. Even if your child really needs those supports, there's no guarantee. And so every time we make some of those shifts, we really have to know that we might have to start that advocacy piece almost from square one. Sometimes it works really seamlessly and other times it does not. And so just as parents, like really we need to know, um, we can't help it if we need to move for employment reasons, right? It can't be controlled. We move to a different part of the province. That can't necessarily be controlled, but we need to know that we're starting over. So I always encourage parents to reach out to the incoming school and say, listen, this is what my student or this is what my child needs. This is what they had at their previous school, and ask that question. Do you offer the same programs and supports? What do you need from me as the parent to ensure my child can access those supports? And oftentimes the school will say, well, we need to see that assessment. We need to review that assessment to ensure that it fits with our criteria. We need to, review what has been in place in that IEP to see if it is something that we can or can't accommodate so that we can be honest with you. And so that we can, and also so that we can look to reassessment. We can, you know, advise you as the parent that it's time to go back to the family doctor for to start this process, or contact your community agency that helps to access other resources. So here in Sudbury, that would be the Children's Community Network. They're like the gateway agency. So if I don't know where I need to go as a parent, I want to go to that gateway agency, and they will help connect me to the services that my child's going to need. So here on the screen, you can see now that we've got our technology working. There's that graph that I was showing you on my phone inconveniently, that explains the learning profile. So that's that learning profile of the student with a learning disability. And like I say, the profile, the graph is really, I find it very easy to understand when I look at it, because I can see where the strengths are and where the needs are without reading it in sentence format. So if your assessment comes from a provider that doesn't offer that, if creating that on your own can definitely be worthwhile. I also want to highlight on the next slide, right here. So we are going to make this presentation available, and you'll see that there's a link to this document about the actual road to advocacy. So all the steps, if yes, do this, if not, go here. And so that's that sort of flow chart that helps us be sure what exactly to do next if we're not sure. Because sometimes we encounter the problem as parents where we go to an agency and we think that, we were in the right place, and we sometimes find out we're not in the right place. And sometimes it's really clear where we need to go next, and sometimes it's not. So the flow chart can be really helpful when you kind of hit a bit of a roadblock and you're okay, now what do I do next? So those are some excellent places to look for information, as well as the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario. Their work is geared towards students with learning disabilities, but their advocacy piece really truly applies to all special needs. The tips and tricks that they offer in there can definitely be helpful to all of us as parents, whether or not the exceptionality that our child has is that of a learning disability. Okay? So I always encourage parents to check that one out as well, just because it's really well done. And like I say, this is what I was just talking about a moment ago. We have that IPRC, we have that IEP, and everything is implemented just as we'd expect it to be. And so when something's not happening, okay, when you're in a situation where you need to advocate because your child's needs aren't being met, there is definitely a ladder on which we go up when we're trying to ensure something is happening. Okay. It's really hard when the principal hears from a parent and they haven't talked to the resource teacher first, because oftentimes, especially in larger schools, that principal might be responsible for 1,000 or 1,500 kids. And it's not that your child isn't important, but for them to know your child's IEP out of the 1,500 kids in their building, it kind of puts it, it makes it difficult for them to perhaps respond appropriately when you call. Whereas if you start with the teacher or the resource teacher and you have that conversation with them in an elementary school and say, listen, you know, my child's needs are being met, we need to work on something, then they are now the holder of that concern for you, and they can bring that and give that background information to the principal, so that if you don't get what you need from the resource teacher and you call the principal, you've already shown your willingness to work with the school because you started with the teacher and the resource teacher and you tried there to get your child's needs met. Sometimes if the principal is unable to resolve the issue, then we have coordinators or consultants of special education. Okay. Both secondary and elementary look the same. Sometimes they're called coordinators, sometimes they're called consultants, sometimes they're called special education coordinators, sometimes they're called student services coordinators, depending on the board or region you're in. But there are members whose responsibility it is to help liaison between the board and the school, and their focus is special education. So they know all the notes of accessing different programs and services. And of course, they themselves are accountable to the superintendent of education. So if concerns aren't resolved, we work our way up, but we always start with the teacher and the resource teacher first. Okay. Sometimes in secondary, we call them program leaders or department heads instead of resource teachers, but they really fulfill that same role. And like I was alluding to a few minutes ago, when we make changes, when we change schools, this is where it can be challenging for parents. Sometimes it goes really smoothly, like I say. You might have a child in a small self contained class and you're moving to a different part of the province. And you visit the school and you say, so my child needs a space in a self contained class, and there happens to be one available. And the school looks at the assessment and says, awesome, that's great, your child fits, off we go. And it can be very smooth. Sometimes there can be challenges because there isn't a space available at the time at which you move. So we have to make adjustments and we have to sometimes apply through a placement process to make those things happen. Sometimes the kind of classroom your child's been in isn't available. Not all intensive support classrooms look the same. Sometimes we have specialized intensive support classrooms, maybe for students with autism or maybe students with social emotional needs. So where your child is now, there may not be an exact same classroom in that new school board. There might be something similar, but it might not be the exact same. And so we always have to kind of negotiate and figure that out and find the best way into the programs that best support our students. Right. And then finally, I think the other part that's important to know is that elementary and secondary works really differently. In elementary school, with the IEP, we often we accommodate, of course, when we can, but we also will modify the curriculum, make adjustments to the grade level or the number of expectations. But in secondary, things run a little bit differently. Instead of modifying for individuals, in secondary, schools stream. So you'll often hear when you think about secondary school, you'll hear academic courses, or you'll hear words like applied courses and locally developed courses or essentials courses. And those courses are different. And so to access some of those, the expectation is that students are working at grade level. Okay, so it really, you have to understand what those pathways look like so that you know that your child's IEP, because it's going to be setting you on a pathway and you want to make sure it's the pathway that is best for your child. Okay, and so just knowing that those things can be different and feel different. Some students in ISP classes in high school are working on credit bearing courses and some are not. And it just really just depends on their needs. So it's important as a parent to know what exactly is my child working on. And that again gets outlined in the IEP. So you'll know which courses your child's working on that are going to be credit bearing and what are maybe life skills courses or other courses that are really important to your child, but aren't necessarily going to yield an OSSD credit. Okay? So that's important to know. And then also to just changing schools and changing boards, like say we move, it happens. And when we do that, it really is up to the incoming school to review the assessment that drove your child's IEP and the content of the IEP, and to figure out if they are going to recognize that, and if they can recognize that. And if there is, like I say, a compatible classroom that fits with what your child has been experiencing up till now. So just know that it's not always guaranteed and it's not always a smooth transition. So again, I have thrown a lot of information at you because the IEP is legally driven. It's full of all kinds of legal wording. And so for parents that are new to the process, it can feel overwhelming. So I've got a couple of resources here to point you to. So one is the government, the Ministry of Education's resource for special education. It's a big document, several hundred pages, but it includes all of the details of what belongs in an IEP. And all of the IEPs in every board are written to that standard. And in fact, the government actually audits boards periodically to make sure that our IEPs actually meet those standards. So just so you know. And like I said earlier at the beginning of the presentation, PCNH has a great glossary with all those special education acronyms that I can say in my sleep, but might make other people go cross-eyed because it's a lot. It's a lot of acronyms and a lot of lingo. So it's always there for you as well. And finally, CMHO has a great website all about mental health and how that connects to student needs. And there is definitely a component to IEPs on their site, because those things can often go hand in hand. We know that children's mental health needs can impact their learning. And so, because they can impact learning, the IEP is a great way to make sure that your child's needs are being met, whether they meet criteria for exceptionality and it's called an IEP, or whether it's called an IEP or a non exceptional IEP. Same idea, right? We recognize this child has this need, and here's what we're going to do for you. So, with that, I've talked a lot at you. And maybe those of you that have, or maybe those of you are wondering, so where's Ben? You know, he talks like he's 20, he writes like he's 6. Where is he now? He's actually in grade 8 right now, and he has recently made a switch to a new school this year. So he's moved, and he's actually moved from one board to another. And so what's actually happened to him is his formal identification that he held with the previous board isn't going to be recognized. His assessment is old; it's from when he was younger. So as a parent, and his dad and I, we need to start over. So right now we're working on a non-exceptional IEP, and we're asking for that SIA technology, that computer that he needs to be successful. Okay, so I'm in the trenches with you. I really understand what it's like. I've sat at the IEP table as a parent, and I've also sat at the IEP table as an educator. And so I know it's not always an easy process. And I know sometimes as a parent, it can be really intimidating, because when you sit for IPRC or IEP meetings, there's often the classroom teacher, the resource teacher, there's an administrator, sometimes there's a special education consultant, there's a whole bunch of people at the table, and there's you. and maybe your spouse, if you can both get the day off work. And so that can feel overwhelming. That can be a lot on the emotions, especially when we have to deal with difficult content or difficult situations. So just know that you're not alone, and also know that you have the right as a parent to bring an advocate with you to those meetings. And sometimes that advocate can be from a local agency. We have great advocates in Sudbury at CCN that will attend meetings. The Learning Disabilities Association here in Sudbury also has advocates that will come for students with learning disabilities to sit around the table with you. And so if your child has a different need, there are usually agencies for most needs. So, you can contact the Down syndrome organization in your area if you need an advocate. They often do advocacy work as well. So yeah, and sometimes you need multiple advocates, because sometimes your child's needs are complex, and you're going to need an advocate who's there to help speak about the learning disability that your child has. But I might sit at the table sometime and need my advocate, the clinician perhaps that works with my child at Compass, needs to be there too, because they're working on specific goals related to mental health. And so we need everybody at the table in order to have an IEP that meets all of those child's needs. So yeah, that's where we're at. If anyone
Thank you so much, Kara. That was great. My apologies for the technical difficulties. I have no idea what happened there. I do apologize. We are recording this, so we will be able to share this back if that kind of got you a little bit lost. My apologies again. We do have a couple of minutes for some questions. If any of you wanted to write a question in the chat, or if you wanted to unmute your microphone to ask a question, I'm going to stop recording now, and then we can have a couple of minutes of questions.
So Sherry says that information should be at each board SEAC and the Special Education Advisory Committee. Absolutely. And there are great